Some truths are too heavy to carry alone, yet too important to leave buried. The words came from a worn journal that sat on the corner of a scratched wooden desk, its pages yellowed with time. To those who glanced at it in passing, it was just an old notebook. But to Caleb Turner, it was the only piece of his brother's story that the world couldn't erase. Pine Creek, Mississippi, always felt like a town frozen in time. Its streets were narrow and dusty, bordered by sagging wooden porches and the occasional rusted-out truck left to bake in the sun. Neighbors waved at each other in passing, but only if you were the right kind of neighbor. Pine Creek was polite on the surface, but its undercurrent of division ran deep. It was late one sweltering summer night when Caleb Turner first noticed something was wrong. The sun had dipped hours ago, leaving the humid air clinging like a second skin. He sat on the creaky porch of their small house, waiting for his older brother, Jeremiah, to come home. Jeremiah always came home. At 16, Jeremiah was the golden boy of the Turner family. He was the kind of son any parent would be proud of, smart, athletic, and full of dreams that didn't fit within Pine Creek's suffocating borders. On the track team, he was unbeatable, with a natural stride that seemed to defy gravity. Off the track, he carried a sketchbook everywhere, filling its pages with intricate drawings of the world he dreamed of escaping to someday. Jeremiah's got that spark, their mother often said. He's going places. But that night, he didn't come home. Caleb sat on the porch until the distant hoot of an owl gave way to the chirping of crickets, and still, there was no sign of his brother. Inside, their mother had started pacing, her lips moving in silent prayer. Their father, stoic as always, leaned against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, glancing at the clock every few minutes. "He's probably just at Troy's house," their father said, though his voice carried no conviction. Caleb tried to believe him, but a cold knot had already formed in his stomach. Jeremiah wouldn't have stayed out this late without telling someone. By dawn, panic had set in. Their mother was on the verge of tears, and their father's calm facade had cracked. "We'll go look for him," Mr. Turner said, grabbing his hat and car keys. "He might have gotten into some kind of trouble." Caleb rode shotgun as they drove through the quiet streets of Pine Creek. They checked Troy's house first, then the track field, then the small diner where Jeremiah sometimes worked shifts after school. No one had seen him. It wasn't until they reached the creek that they saw the flashing lights of the sheriff's car. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring and craning their necks to see what was happening. Caleb's heart pounded as he jumped out of the car, running toward the commotion. "Jeremiah," he shouted, his voice cracking. His brother was there, sitting on the ground by the edge of the creek. His clothes were soaked, his hands muddy, and his face pale and drawn. Two deputies stood over him, their expressions cold and distant. "Jeremiah." Caleb called again, rushing forward, but one of the deputies held up a hand to stop him. "Stay back, kid," the deputy barked. "What's going on?" Mr. Turner demanded, arriving behind Caleb. Sheriff Miller, a tall man with a weathered face and a perpetual sneer, stepped forward. "We found your boy near the scene of a robbery at Henderson's grocery. Got mud on his shoes and no explanation for why he was out here at this hour." "That's ridiculous," Mr. Turner said, his voice rising. "Jeremiah didn't rob anyone." Sheriff Miller shrugged. "We'll let the judge sort that out. For now, he's coming with us." Jeremiah looked up at his father and brother, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. "I didn't do anything, Pop," he said, his voice trembling. "I swear, I didn't." But his words fell on deaf ears as the deputies hauled him to his feet and shoved him toward the patrol car. The ride home was silent. Caleb stared out the window, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind, the mud on Jeremiah's hands, the way the sheriff's eyes narrowed in judgment, the hopelessness in his brother's voice. "Why didn't you stop them?" Caleb blurted out, breaking the silence. Mr. Turner gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You think I didn't want to?" he said, his voice low and strained. "But you know how this town works, Caleb. They see a black boy near a crime scene, and that's all they need." Caleb didn't respond. He felt a deep, gnawing anger, not just at the sheriff or the deputies, but at the entire town of Pine Creek. A town that had always treated them as second-class citizens, no matter how hard they worked or how much they contributed. When they got home, Mrs. Turner was waiting on the porch, her face lined with worry. Caleb didn't have to say anything, the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "He didn't do it, Mama," Caleb said quietly, his voice cracking. "Jeremiah wouldn't do something like that." "I know, baby," she said, pulling him into a hug. "We'll get him back. We'll fight this." But even as she spoke, Caleb could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The Turner family wasted no time trying to clear Jeremiah's name. Early the next morning, Mr. Turner headed into town to find a lawyer, while Caleb and his mother visited neighbors, hoping to piece together any information that could help. But Pine Creek wasn't the kind of town where people stuck their necks out for others, especially for a black family like the Turners. Mr. Turner returned that afternoon with a man named Daniel Wheeler, one of the few lawyers in town willing to take on cases for Pine Creek's black residents. Wheeler was middle-aged and soft-spoken, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything. "I'll be honest with you," Wheeler said, sitting at the Turners' kitchen table. The decks stacked against Jeremiah. Henderson's grocery is owned by one of the wealthiest families in Pine Creek, and Sheriff Miller's word carries a lot of weight in this town. "But there's no real evidence," Mrs. Turner said, her voice trembling. "They didn't even give him a chance to explain himself." Wheeler nodded. "That's true, but the jury won't see it that way. The sheriff claims Jeremiah was found near the scene with mud on his shoes, and they'll spin that into enough for a conviction." Caleb listened from the corner of the room, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "What about witnesses?" he asked. "There has to be someone who saw what really happened." Wheeler sighed. "If there are, they're not coming forward. People in this town don't like to rock the boat, especially when it comes to cases like this." "What do you mean, cases like this?" Caleb demanded, his voice rising. Wheeler glanced at him, then at Mr. Turner. "I mean cases where the defendant is black, and the accusation comes from someone with power." The words hung heavy in the air. That weekend, the family was allowed to visit Jeremiah in the county jail. The small, cramped visiting room smelled of sweat and bleach, and the sight of Jeremiah in an orange jumpsuit behind a glass partition made Caleb's stomach churn. Jeremiah tried to smile as they approached, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Ma," he said softly, pressing his hands against the glass. "Hey, Pop Caleb." Mrs. Turner immediately burst into tears. "Jeremiah, baby, we're gonna get you out of here. You hear me? We're gonna fight this." "I know, Mama," Jeremiah said, though his voice was tinged with doubt. He looked at Caleb, his expression serious. "You believe me, don't you?" "Of course I do," Caleb said quickly. "I know you didn't do it." Jeremiah nodded, relief flickering across his face. "I was just at the creek that night, sketching. I couldn't sleep, so I went out to clear my head. That's all." "Did you see anyone else there?" Mr. Turner asked. Jeremiah hesitated, then shook his head. "No. It was quiet. I didn't even hear anyone coming until the deputies showed up." Mrs. Turner's hands trembled as she reached for a tissue. "This isn't right," she said, her voice breaking. "They're treating you like a criminal for sitting by the creek." Jeremiah leaned closer to the glass. "It's gonna be okay, Mama. I just need you all to stay strong for me." But as the guards ushered them out at the end of the visit, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that his brother was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince them. Over the next few weeks, Caleb threw himself into finding evidence to clear Jeremiah's name. He skipped school to interview people around town, scouring the streets and asking questions until his legs ached. He visited Henderson's grocery, hoping to find something the sheriff had missed. The owner, Mr. Henderson, was a wiry man with sharp features and a permanent frown. He eyed Caleb suspiciously as he entered the store. "You're that Turner boy, aren't you?" Henderson asked, his tone cold. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about what happened the night of the robbery." Henderson scowled. "Ain't much to tell. Someone broke in after closing, stole some cash and a few cartons of cigarettes. The sheriff says it was your brother, and I trust his judgment. But you didn't see who did it?" Caleb pressed. "Nope. And I don't need to. The sheriff's word is good enough for me." Caleb left the store feeling defeated, but he refused to give up. He spent hours poring over newspapers at the library, searching for articles about similar crimes in nearby towns. He even tried to talk to the deputies who had arrested Jeremiah, but they brushed him off with smirks and condescending remarks. "You should let this go, kid," one of them said. "You're not gonna like what you find." As the trial date approached, Pine Creek's already fragile sense of community began to fracture. Some of the town's black residents rallied behind the Turners, showing up at their house with food, prayers, and words of encouragement. "Jeremiah's a good boy," said Mrs. Hattie, an elderly neighbor who had known the family for years. "The Lord will see the truth come out." But others weren't so optimistic. "Doesn't matter what he did or didn't do," one man muttered at the barbershop. "The court's already made up its mind." The white residents of Pine Creek, for the most part, remained silent. Those who believed in Jeremiah's innocence didn't dare speak out, and those who believed in his guilt were all too happy to let the system do its work. For Caleb, the silence was deafening. The day of Jeremiah's trial dawned heavy and gray, the sky choked with thick clouds that mirrored the weight in Caleb's chest. Pine Creek's courthouse was an old, imposing building, its once white columns now streaked with grime. It stood at the center of town like a reminder of who held the power. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The courtroom was packed, black residents sat on one side, quiet and somber, while white residents filled the other, murmuring amongst themselves. Caleb sat between his parents in the front row, gripping the edge of the bench so tightly his fingers ached. Jeremiah was led in through a side door, his wrists shackled. His orange jumpsuit stood out sharply against the polished wood of the courtroom. He glanced at his family, offering them a faint, apologetic smile. "Please rise," the bailiff intoned, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Judge Harland entered, a heavy-set man with a face that betrayed no emotion. He settled into his seat with a deliberate slowness, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Let's get started," he said, his tone bored. The prosecutor, a slick, sharp-tongued man named Raymond Sykes, began his opening statement with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, pacing in front of them. "This case is simple. Jeremiah Turner was found near the scene of the crime, with mud on his shoes that matches the prints found outside Henderson's grocery. An eyewitness saw someone fleeing the scene, and their description matches the defendant. The evidence is clear, and justice must be served." Sykes turned toward Jeremiah, his eyes narrowing. "Theft is a crime that erodes the fabric of our community. We cannot let it go unpunished." Caleb felt his mother tense beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Next, the prosecution called their witnesses. The first was Deputy Carter, one of the officers who had arrested Jeremiah. Carter spoke with the same smugness Caleb had seen that night at the creek. "We found the defendant sitting by the water, looking guilty as sin," Carter said. "His shoes were covered in mud, just like the footprints we found near the broken window at Henderson's." "Did the defendant say anything when you approached him?" Sykes asked. Carter nodded. "He claimed he was just out for a walk. But it didn't add up. Why would he be out there alone, at that hour?" The second witness was an elderly man named Walter Briggs. Walter Briggs shuffled to the witness stand, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. He was one of Pine Creek's oldest residents, a fixture in the community for as long as anyone could remember. Caleb watched him closely, searching for any sign of doubt in his lined face. "Mr. Briggs," the prosecutor began, his voice oozing with false politeness, "can you tell the court what you saw on the night of the robbery?" Briggs adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as if trying to recall the scene. "Well," he said slowly, "I was sittin' on my porch that night, around 9 or so. I saw someone runnin' down the road near Henderson's. Couldn't make out much in the dark, but he looked young. Tall. And I reckon he was about the same build as that boy there." He pointed a gnarled finger at Jeremiah, whose face remained stoic. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," Sykes said with a satisfied nod. "No further questions." Wheeler rose from his seat, his expression calm but determined. "Mr. Briggs," he began, "you said it was dark, correct?" "Sure was," Briggs replied. "And yet, you're confident that the person you saw running matched my client's build?" Briggs hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, I guess I ain't certain. But he looked about right." Wheeler nodded. "So, you couldn't clearly see the runner's face?" "No," Briggs admitted. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs. That will be all." Caleb exhaled quietly. Briggs's testimony had been shaky, but the damage was already done. The jury, all 12 of them white, seemed more inclined to trust the word of a longtime resident than to question it. When it was Wheeler's turn to present the defense, he rose from his chair with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew he had to fight with everything he had. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wheeler began, addressing the jury, "this case is not as simple as the prosecution would have you believe. There is no direct evidence tying Jeremiah Turner to this crime. No fingerprints, no stolen items found in his possession, nothing but circumstantial evidence and assumptions." He turned to the judge. "I'd like to call my first witness, Jeremiah Turner." Jeremiah stood and walked to the stand, his chains clinking softly with each step. Caleb felt his heart twist at the sight, his brother, shackled and vulnerable, facing a room full of people who had already decided his fate. "Jeremiah," Wheeler said gently, "can you tell the court where you were on the night of the robbery?" Jeremiah took a deep breath. "I was at the creek. I couldn't sleep, so I went there to sketch. I was just sitting by the water, drawing in my notebook, when the deputies showed up and arrested me." "Did you hear or see anything unusual that night?" Jeremiah shook his head. "No. It was quiet. I didn't even know anything had happened until they told me about the robbery." Wheeler held up a small, battered sketchbook. "Is this the notebook you were using that night?" "Yes," Jeremiah replied. Wheeler opened the sketchbook and flipped through its pages, showing the court several detailed drawings of the creek and its surroundings. These sketches were dated by Jeremiah the night of his arrest. They proved that he was doing exactly what he said he was, sitting by the creek, drawing. Sykes objected. "The sketches prove nothing, Your Honor. He could have drawn them any time." Judge Harlan nodded. Sustained. Caleb's stomach sank. Even the truth, laid bare in Jeremiah's own hand, wasn't enough to sway the court. The defense's second witness was Jeremiah's track coach, Mr. Dillard, a wiry man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Jeremiah's one of the most disciplined kids I've ever coached," Dillard said firmly. "He's never been in trouble before. He's focused, hard-working, and dedicated to his team." "Would you say Jeremiah has the character of someone who would commit a robbery?" Wheeler asked. "Absolutely not," Dillard replied. Sykes was quick to cross-examine. "Mr. Dillard, you weren't with Jeremiah the night of the robbery, were you?" "No," Dillard admitted. "So, you can't say for certain where he was or what he was doing?" Dillard hesitated, then sighed. "No, I can't." "Thank you," Sykes said smugly. As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their final arguments. Sykes painted a damning picture of Jeremiah as a delinquent who had made a poor decision and now wanted to avoid the consequences. "Justice isn't about what we want to believe," he said. "It's about facts. And the facts point to Jeremiah Turner as the guilty party." Wheeler countered with a passionate plea for reason. "Jeremiah Turner is an innocent young man whose only crime is being in the wrong place at the wrong time," Wheeler said. "This case is built on nothing but assumptions and prejudice. I ask you, the jury, to look beyond the surface and see the truth." But as Caleb watched the jury file out of the room to begin deliberations, he felt a sinking certainty in his chest. The truth didn't matter in Pine Creek. The jury returned after only 2 hours, their expressions grim but composed. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as they filed back into the courtroom, their footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of doom. "Please rise," the bailiff intoned. Jeremiah stood, his shackled hands trembling slightly. Caleb glanced at his brother's face, searching for some sign of hope, but all he saw was the same resigned determination that had settled over Jeremiah since the arrest. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harland asked. The foreman, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stiff posture, stood and cleared his throat. "We have, Your Honor." "What say you?" The foreman avoided looking at Jeremiah as he spoke. "On the charge of robbery, we find the defendant, Jeremiah Turner, guilty." A gasp rippled through the black side of the courtroom. Mrs. Turner let out a muffled cry, clutching her husband's arm as tears streamed down her face. Caleb felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving him lightheaded and numb. "Order," the judge barked, slamming his gavel as murmurs rose on both sides of the courtroom. Jeremiah closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, his expression calm despite the turmoil around him. Caleb couldn't understand how his brother could stand so still, so composed, while the world fell apart. Judge Harlan's voice cut through the noise. "Sentencing will take place tomorrow at noon. Court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, the Turner family was surrounded by a small group of supporters, friends, neighbors, and church members who had come to show their solidarity. "This ain't right," muttered Mr. Lewis, a family friend. "They had no real evidence, and everyone knows it." "That jury made up its mind the moment they saw Jeremiah's face," added Mrs. Hattie, shaking her head. Caleb stayed silent, his fists clenched as he stared at the courthouse steps. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tear down the system that had taken his brother's freedom. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. As they walked to their car, reporters swarmed them, their cameras flashing, their voices blending into an unintelligible cacophony. "Do you think justice was served today?" one of them shouted. "Do you plan to appeal the verdict?" asked another. Mr. Turner raised his hand to shield his wife from the onslaught. "No comment," he said firmly, ushering his family into the car. The next day, the courtroom was quieter but no less tense. The judge wasted no time. "Jeremiah Turner," Judge Harlan began, "you have been found guilty of robbery. While I take into account your lack of prior offenses, the seriousness of this crime requires a significant penalty. I hereby sentence you to 10 years at Parchman Farm." Mrs. Turner sobbed openly, and even Mr. Turner's stoic demeanor cracked as he buried his face in his hands. Caleb felt a wave of rage and despair wash over him. Parchman Farm was notorious, a place where prisoners were treated as little more than slaves, forced to work in brutal conditions with no hope of redemption. Jeremiah stood tall, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "I didn't do this," he said, his words clear and unwavering. "But I'm going to survive, no matter what you throw at me. You won't break me." Judge Harlan didn't flinch. "Bailiff, take him away." As Jeremiah was led out of the courtroom, he turned to his family one last time. "Stay strong," he said. "This isn't the end." But for Caleb, it felt like it was. That night, Caleb sat on the porch with Jeremiah's sketchbook in his lap. He flipped through its pages, each drawing a testament to the vibrant mind that Pine Creek had condemned. His brother wasn't guilty, Caleb knew that with every fiber of his being. And if no one else was willing to fight for Jeremiah, he would. "I'll find a way to bring you home," Caleb whispered into the humid night. "No matter what it takes." The weight of the task ahead felt enormous, but Caleb clung to the promise he had made to himself. He wouldn't let the system erase Jeremiah's story. The days following Jeremiah's sentencing were heavy with despair, but Caleb refused to let it paralyze him. He couldn't change the verdict, but he could search for the truth. His brother's life might be confined to the brutal walls of Parchment Farm, but Caleb's fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Turner house became a hub of activity as Caleb pored over court documents, reread the witness testimonies, and scrawled notes in a spiral notebook. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "You should be in school, Caleb," his father said one afternoon, standing in the doorway to the living room. "And Jeremiah should be home," Caleb shot back, his voice tight. Mr. Turner sighed, rubbing his temples. He was a man worn thin, his strength drained by the constant battle against a world that refused to bend. "Just, don't let it consume you, son." But Caleb was already consumed. A month after the sentencing, the Turners made the long drive to Parchment Farm to visit Jeremiah. The penitentiary loomed like a fortress, its tall fences topped with razor wire, and its guards patrolling with watchful eyes. The visiting area was stark and cold, a room with bolted-down chairs and thick glass partitions. Caleb's stomach churned as he sat down, waiting for Jeremiah to appear. When his brother finally walked in, Caleb barely recognized him. The confident, bright-eyed teenager who had once been the pride of Pine Creek's track team now looked thin and tired, his shoulders hunched under the weight of an invisible burden. "Hey, little brother," Jeremiah said, forcing a smile as he picked up the phone on his side of the glass. Caleb grabbed the receiver, his throat tight. "Hey," he managed, his voice cracking. Their mother's sobs broke the silence. "Oh, baby," she said, pressing her hand against the glass. "They're not treating you right, are they?" Jeremiah hesitated, then shook his head. "It's rough," he admitted. "But I'm holding on. Don't worry about me, Mama. Just, keep living your lives." Caleb leaned forward. "I'm not giving up, Jeremiah," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to prove you didn't do it." Jeremiah's smile faltered. "I appreciate that, Caleb. I do. But you're up against more than just a bad jury. This whole system, it's designed to keep people like us down. Don't let it take you under too." But Caleb wasn't listening. His mind was already racing with plans. Caleb's first breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Mr. Lewis, the old mechanic who owned a shop near Henderson's grocery. "You really think your brother's innocent?" Lewis asked one evening as Caleb sat in the shop, pretending to help him sort bolts. "I don't think," Caleb replied. "I know." Lewis nodded slowly. "I don't know if it means anything, but I remember seeing a truck parked near Henderson's that night. Didn't think much of it at the time, but it wasn't one I recognized." "What kind of truck?" Caleb asked, his pulse quickening. "Blue Ford," Lewis said. "Had a dent in the driver's door. Looked like it had been there a while." Caleb scribbled the information in his notebook. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had before. Over the next few weeks, Caleb scoured Pine Creek, looking for the Blue Ford. He asked questions at gas stations, diners, and auto shops, always careful not to draw too much attention. One afternoon, he found it parked behind a row of trailers on the outskirts of town. The truck was covered in dust, its dented door unmistakable. Caleb's heart raced as he crouched nearby, jotting down the license plate number. But as he stepped away, a voice called out behind him. "Hey! What are you doing?" Caleb turned to see a young man standing on the porch of one of the trailers, his arms crossed and his eyes narrowing. "Just looking for someone," Caleb stammered, his palms sweating. "You lost?" the man asked, his tone sharp. Caleb shook his head. "No, sir. I'll be on my way." He walked away as calmly as he could, but once he was out of sight, he broke into a run. That night, Caleb shared his findings with Mr. Wheeler, the lawyer. "Lewis saw this truck near Henderson's the night of the robbery," Caleb said, showing him the plate number. "And I found it out by the trailers on Birch Road. We need to find out who owns it." Wheeler looked skeptical. "Even if the truck was there, it doesn't prove the driver committed the crime. The prosecution will argue it's just a coincidence." "It's more than we had before," Caleb insisted. "Please, Mr. Wheeler. Just look into it." Wheeler sighed but agreed. Over the next few days, he traced the plate to a man named Doug Kirby, a troublemaker with a history of petty crimes and a reputation for stirring up trouble at the local bars. When Wheeler confronted him, Kirby denied everything. "Don't know what you're talking about," Kirby said, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't anywhere near Henderson's that night." But Caleb wasn't convinced. Kirby's smug demeanor and quick denial only made him more suspicious. Caleb couldn't let it go. One evening, he followed Kirby to a bar on the edge of town, determined to get answers. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap beer. Caleb watched from a corner booth as Kirby laughed loudly with his friends, oblivious to the young boy keeping an eye on him. When Kirby got up to leave, Caleb followed him outside. "Doug Kirby," Caleb called, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Kirby turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "I'm Jeremiah Turner's brother," Caleb said, stepping closer. "And I think you know he didn't rob Henderson's." Kirby snorted. "You got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But you're barking up the wrong tree." "Am I?" Caleb pressed. "Because I know your truck was near the store that night." Kirby's smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. "You don't know a damn thing." But Caleb saw it, the crack in his facade. "I'm not giving up," Caleb said firmly. "One way or another, the truth is coming out." Kirby didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, leaving Caleb standing alone in the dark. Caleb's confrontation with Doug Kirby left him shaken but determined. He was close, he could feel it, but close wasn't enough. He needed concrete evidence, something undeniable that would force the truth into the light. 2 nights later, Caleb's break came unexpectedly. He was sitting on the porch, staring at Jeremiah's sketchbook under the dim glow of the porch light, when a familiar voice called out from the shadows. "Caleb." He looked up to see Henry Carter, the night clerk from Henderson's grocery, standing at the gate. Carter's face was pale, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Mr. Carter?" Caleb said, rising to his feet. "What are you doing here?" Carter glanced over his shoulder, his body tense. "I heard you've been asking questions about the robbery." "That's right," Caleb replied, his heart racing. "You know something?" Carter hesitated, then nodded. "I saw who did it that night. It wasn't your brother." Caleb motioned for Carter to come inside, but the older man shook his head. "Can't stay long," he said, his voice low. "Don't want anyone seeing me here." "What did you see?" Caleb pressed, stepping closer. "It was Doug Kirby," Carter said, his voice trembling. "I saw him break the window and go inside. He came out with a bag, and I saw him toss it into his truck before driving off. But when the sheriff showed up, I didn't say anything. I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared of what happens to people who talk too much in this town," Carter admitted. "But I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Your brother doesn't deserve to be in that place." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the proof they needed. "Will you tell the lawyer?" Caleb asked urgently. Carter hesitated, his face conflicted. I'll try, he said finally. But you know how this town works. Don't expect a miracle. The next morning, Caleb relayed everything to Mr. Wheeler, who immediately set about filing a motion to reopen the case. He tracked down Carter and managed to get a sworn statement, though Carter's reluctance was evident. This is the kind of evidence we've been waiting for, Wheeler told Caleb. But it's going to be an uphill battle. Caleb nodded grimly. We don't have a choice. A hearing was scheduled to review the motion. Caleb and his parents sat in the courtroom once again, their hopes pinned on Carter's testimony. But when Carter was called to the stand, his nerves betrayed him. Under cross-examination by the prosecutor, Carter faltered, his answers growing more uncertain with each question. Mr. Carter, Sykes said smoothly, you claim to have seen Doug Kirby commit this crime, yet you waited months to come forward. Why is that? I was scared, Carter stammered. Scared of what? Doing the right thing. Carter's face flushed. No, Let me ask you this, Sykes interrupted. Isn't it possible you're mistaken? That it wasn't Doug Kirby you saw, but someone else? Carter hesitated, glancing at Caleb. I don't think so. Don't think so isn't certainty, Mr. Carter, Sykes said, turning to the judge. Your Honor, this testimony is unreliable at best. Judge Harland looked down at Carter, his expression unreadable. I'm inclined to agree, he said finally. Motion denied. Caleb felt like the air had been knocked out of him. As the courtroom emptied, he sat frozen, staring at the empty witness stand. It's not over, Wheeler said, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. We can appeal. But Caleb barely heard him. He knew the truth, but the system didn't care. No amount of evidence would undo the injustice that had been done. The weeks that followed were a blur. The Turners visited Jeremiah at Parchman when they could, but the strain of seeing him in such a place took its toll. Caleb withdrew from his friends, his schoolwork, and even his family, retreating into a world of quiet rage. The town of Pine Creek moved on, its residents content to let Jeremiah's story fade into the background. Doug Kirby remained free, his life untouched by the crime he had committed. One afternoon, Caleb stood by the creek where Jeremiah had been arrested, staring at the water as it flowed endlessly forward. He clutched Jeremiah's sketchbook tightly in his hands, his mind racing with what could have been. I'm sorry, Jeremiah, he whispered. I tried. Years later, Caleb would leave Pine Creek, determined to build a life far from the town that had taken his brother's freedom. But he never forgot. Jeremiah's story became a driving force in his life, shaping the man he became and the battles he chose to fight. He carried his brother's sketchbook with him wherever he went, a reminder of the dreams that had been stolen but not silenced. Because even though justice had failed Jeremiah, Caleb vowed never to stop telling his story. Thank you so much for watching this video and taking the time to explore this fascinating story with us. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us, and God bless us all.